The prairie stretched wide beneath the rising sun, endless and untamed, dotted with patches of sagebrush that swayed in the cool morning breeze. Out there, where the horizon seemed to burn into the sky, a cowboy saddled his horse and rode off with his rifle slung across his back. He had left the little log cabin on the edge of the village with one simple aim: bring back meat for the week. The smoke curling from chimneys told of hungry families waiting on stew pots that were almost empty. In that old American village of the late 1800s, survival was a daily rhythm, and hunting was more than work. It was a duty. The man had the rugged look of someone shaped by wind and grit. His hands were calloused, his face worn by sun and years of hard labor. And yet there was something steady in his blue-gray eyes that spoke of resilience. He knew the land like the back of his hand. He knew where the deer tended to graze and where the rabbits darted across fields of tall grass. As he rode farther from the village, the stillness of the wild wrapped around him. All he heard was the soft clop of hooves and the distant cry of a hawk overhead. Hours passed without a single shot fired. Tracks he followed led to nothing but empty brush. His stomach tightened at the thought of returning with nothing. He dismounted near a creek, crouching low to study the ground. It was then that something else caught his attention. Not deer tracks, not rabbit prints, but the faint impression of bare feet. They were too small for a man's and too fresh to ignore. The hairs on his neck prickled as he followed the trail. The prints led him deeper into a grove where the trees grew close and the shadows thickened. A strange silence hovered, heavier than before. Then he saw her. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, but as he stepped closer, the shape on the ground came into focus. It was a young Apache woman, her dress torn, her skin marked with scrapes and bruises. One arm hung limp at her side, and a streak of blood ran down from her shoulder. She was still breathing, but barely. For a long moment the cowboy froze, staring at her as though the wild itself had presented him with an impossible choice. He had expected a deer or maybe a wild turkey to bring home. Instead, here was a wounded woman from a people the village feared and mistrusted. The Apaches were spoken of in whispers, remembered in tales of raids and clashes. To carry her back would be to invite questions, maybe even anger. Yet to leave her here meant certain death. His horse shifted uneasily, sensing the weight of the moment. The cowboy lowered his rifle, kneeling beside her. He saw the way her chest rose shallowly, how her lips parted as if trying to form words she could not speak. Her hair was long and dark, braided with a single feather that clung stubbornly even in her state. She looked like someone who had fought hard, someone who had endured more than most could imagine. Without thinking much further, he slid his arms beneath her and lifted her. She was lighter than he expected, though every movement drew a faint groan from her lips. He placed her gently across the saddle and mounted up, keeping one arm steady around her so she would not fall. The horse snorted and took off toward home, its hooves pounding the earth as though it understood the urgency. The cowboy's mind raced as the wind whipped past his face. What would he tell the folks back at the cabin village? They were waiting on meat, not a stranger. Some would call him foolish, others might say dangerous, but he could not shake the image of her lying there alone in the grove, left to die. Whatever had happened to her, she hadn't asked for this. She hadn't asked to be hunted or hurt. By the time the log cabins came into view, the woman's breathing had steadied some, though she remained unconscious in his arms. He slowed his horse, his jaw set tight. Smoke curled from the chimneys, and children's laughter echoed faintly between the houses. But when the villagers caught sight of what he carried, the laughter died. Men stepped from porches, women peered from windows, and whispers began to ripple through the air. He dismounted, carrying her as though she were the most fragile thing in the world. No one came forward to help. Instead, they stared, some with fear, others with suspicion. A few muttered about Apache raids, about dangers of bringing such a person into their midst. The cowboy ignored them, walking straight toward his own cabin. His boots struck the dirt with heavy purpose, every step echoing louder than the last. Inside, he laid her on his bed, his hands trembling just slightly. He fetched water, tore strips from an old shirt, and began to clean her wounds as best he could. Her skin was warm beneath his rough fingers, the heat of fever rising fast. He had no skill of a doctor, but he knew enough to see she wouldn't make it without care. As he worked, he wondered what had happened to her. Had she been caught in a raid? Had she been cast out by her own people? Or worse, had someone from the village done this to her? The questions weighed heavy, but none had answers yet. All he knew was that she was here, and now she was his responsibility. The fire crackled in the hearth, throwing flickers of light across the room as the evening crept closer. Outside, the villagers still whispered, waiting for him to step out and explain. But he stayed inside, guarding her as though any shadow might rise up to steal her away. For a while, the room was filled only with the sound of her faint breathing and the crackle of fire. Then, just before darkness settled completely, her eyes opened. Dark, wary, sharp even through her weakness, they fixed on him. She didn't speak, but her gaze carried a storm of fear and mistrust. The cowboy froze, his hand hovering above her bandaged arm. In that moment, he realized what he had brought into his home was more than a wounded stranger. It was the beginning of something that would test every bond in the village and every line drawn between two worlds. She flinched as he moved, her breath quickening, but she didn't look away. The unspoken tension in that tiny cabin was thicker than the smoke curling above the fire. Outside, night settled over the prairie, coyotes calling in the distance, and the old village waited, restless and uneasy. Inside, the cowboy knew one thing for certain. His life had just changed forever. And as her lips parted, a whisper forming, he leaned closer, unsure whether the words she spoke would save them both, or doom them. The cowboy leaned closer, waiting for her to speak, but the words never fully came. Her lips trembled, forming a sound too faint to catch. Then her eyes shut again, as if the effort had drained what little strength she had left. He sat back slowly, his chest tight, and listened to the faint rise and fall of her breathing. For the first time in years, he felt the kind of uncertainty that made a man question every choice. He had hunted in storms, faced wolves, even lost friends to the dangers of the prairie. But nothing had prepared him for this moment, carrying an Apache woman into his cabin, nursing her wounds and wondering what storm he had just invited into his life. Outside, the night grew thicker, and the silence of the village seemed to press against his walls. He knew the folks would not sleep easy knowing she was inside. Some might already be thinking about knocking on his door, demanding answers. He stoked the fire higher, hoping the crackle of the flames would drown out the restless thoughts rattling in his skull. He wanted to believe he had done the right thing. Yet in a land where old grudges and new fears lived side by side, the line between right and wrong was rarely clear. When morning came, he was still seated near the bed, head tipped against the wall, eyes heavy from lack of rest. He stirred at the faintest sound. Her breathing had changed. She shifted slightly, her brow furrowing as if caught between pain and memory. For the first time, he noticed the small details of her dress, the beadwork at the seams, the faded patterns that hinted at pride and heritage. She wasn't just anyone. She belonged to a people who lived by their own ways, a people who had fought to keep their land while the settlers built cabins and fenced the prairie. He poured water into a wooden cup and touched it lightly to her lips. She drank weakly, then turned her face away, her dark eyes flicking up at him with a sharpness that surprised him. Even wounded, there was strength in her gaze, a refusal to yield fully to weakness. He set the cup down and waited, hoping she would speak this time. But her silence was deliberate, a shield she held against him. The cowboy knew she didn't trust him. Why should she? To her, he was just another white man, another face from the village that had claimed land her people once roamed freely. He rubbed a hand over his beard, thinking about the days when tensions had been worse, when raids and reprisals left both sides broken. The village no longer spoke openly of war, but the scars of it lingered. Children had grown up on stories of fear, and elders had kept their rifles close. That kind of memory didn't fade easily. As the sun climbed higher, he heard voices outside. A couple of men had gathered by the well, their tones hushed but sharp. He stepped out onto the porch, arms crossed, and nodded at them. They paused their talk, staring back with eyes that carried more questions than words. One finally spoke, asking what he was doing bringing her kind into their village. The cowboy didn't answer at first. He just stood there, letting the weight of his silence settle. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but steady. He said he found her wounded and half dead, and leaving her there would have been the same as killing her himself. The men didn't argue, but neither did they look convinced. They muttered something about dangers, about how Apaches didn't just end up hurt in the woods without reason. Then they walked off, leaving the warning unsaid but clear. Trouble was brewing, and his decision had lit the first spark. When he stepped back inside, he found her watching him. She didn't look away this time. It was as though she had heard enough through the thin cabin walls to know what his neighbors thought. The tension between them hung like a rope stretched too tight. He wished he had the words to bridge it, but words weren't his strength. He was a man of action, not speeches. So instead, he sat down and began mending the torn strip of cloth around her arm, careful not to meet her eyes. The days that followed moved slow and heavy. She healed bit by bit, though every movement seemed to cost her something. He hunted again, this time bringing back rabbits and deer, enough to keep questions at bay. Yet every trip into the woods left him uneasy. He kept thinking of how he had found her, wondering who or what had left her in that state. Each time he returned, the whispers in the village grew louder, curiosity twisting into suspicion. Folks asked if she was awake, if she had said anything. He always answered the same: she was still too weak. But the truth was, she had begun to speak in fragments. Not much, just a word here and there in her own tongue, soft and guarded. He didn't understand the language, but he understood the tone. She spoke with caution, never giving more than she meant to. One night, though, he heard her whisper a name. He repeated it quietly, not sure if it was hers or someone else's. When she realized he had heard, she turned away and refused to say another word. That night, he dreamed of the grove where he had found her, of shadows moving in the trees, of hunters not hunting deer but something more. He woke with a start, his hand reaching for the rifle at his side. The fire had burned low, and in its dim glow he saw her sitting up on the bed staring at him. She had not spoken, but the look in her eyes was enough. She knew danger still lingered beyond the cabin walls. The cowboy sat up, rubbing his eyes, and felt the unease settle deep in his bones. He had brought her back thinking the danger was behind her, but what if it had only just begun? Over the next days, he watched the edges of the village closely. Riders passed in the distance, their silhouettes vanishing into the hills. Sometimes at night, the dogs barked at shadows no one else could see. The villagers, already restless about the stranger in his cabin, now grew uneasy about what might be coming their way. Some avoided his eyes altogether. Others made it plain they thought he should turn her out. Still, he couldn't bring himself to do it. Every time he thought of leaving her, he remembered the way she had looked in that grove. Broken, abandoned, fighting for breath. A man could kill with his rifle, but he could also kill with indifference. That wasn't the kind of man he wanted to be. The mystery of her past clung to the cabin like smoke. He knew she carried a story, one that was not yet ready to be told, and until she chose to share it, he was left to piece together what little he could from the way she glanced toward the horizon, from the feather braided into her hair, from the scars that marked her arms. She was not just a victim. She was someone who had survived things he could not begin to imagine. And as the nights grew longer and the whispers sharper, he realized something with a weight that pressed heavier than any rifle on his shoulder. He hadn't just brought home a wounded woman. He had brought home a question that would soon demand an answer, not just from him but from the entire village. For now, though, the answer waited, as unresolved as the silence between them. The prairie outside stretched wide and watchful, holding its secrets close. And deep down, the cowboy knew those secrets would not stay buried forever. The days passed, and though the woman's wounds began to knit under the cowboy's steady care, the weight of suspicion from the village only grew heavier. Every time he walked down to the well, he felt eyes on his back. Neighbors who had once greeted him with nods now avoided his gaze. Mothers hushed their children when he passed, as if his choice to bring her in carried some invisible danger that might spill onto anyone too close. It was as if the cabin itself had become a mark of trouble, a place where whispers gathered like storm clouds waiting to break. Inside, the air was tense, but alive. The woman, still guarded, still mostly silent, moved more on her own now, though she did so with careful steps. She would sit by the fire, her fingers tracing the beadwork of her dress as though trying to remember something she had lost. When the cowboy brought in water or wood, she would watch him closely, her sharp eyes catching every small gesture. She had not given him her name, and he had stopped asking. Some things, he knew, had to be offered freely, but what unsettled him most were the nights. Some evenings she would start awake, her breathing heavy, her eyes wild as if she had seen some shadow from her past step into the room. She never explained, but he could tell her dreams carried more than fear. They carried warnings, and each time she stared into the fire afterward, her jaw clenched tight, he felt certain that danger was not far behind. The villagers were restless too. Men gathered near the blacksmith shop, speaking in low tones. The cowboy heard pieces of their talk when he walked by. Words like risk, Apache, and trouble riding this way. A hunter mentioned seeing smoke on the ridge a few miles out. Another swore he spotted riders slipping through the brush at dusk. To some, this was proof that her people were near, watching, waiting. To others, it was a reminder of wounds not healed, stories of raids and blood still lingering in their memory. One evening, an older man from the village came to the cowboy's door. He carried no weapon, only a lantern that threw long shadows across the cabin walls. His voice was calm but edged with warning. He said the woman did not belong here, that keeping her was a mistake the whole settlement might pay for. He spoke of how fragile their peace was, how one spark could burn it to the ground. The cowboy listened, his jaw tight, then simply said he would not send her away. The old man shook his head, his lantern swinging as he walked off, leaving behind a silence heavier than words. The woman had heard it all. She stood near the hearth, her eyes fixed on him. For the first time, she spoke in clear English, her voice low but strong. She asked why he had not left her in the grove. The question cut deeper than any accusation. He looked at her for a long moment, then told her the truth, because leaving her would have been the same as turning his back on what it meant to be a man. She did not answer right away, but something in her expression softened, though only for a moment before the guarded look returned. The tension outside the cabin grew sharper in the following days. A group of younger men rode out at dawn, rifles slung over their shoulders, claiming they meant to check the ridge for signs of movement. When they returned, their faces were pale, their voices quick. They spoke of tracks, many of them cutting across the hills. They could not tell if they were Apache or not, but fear had already taken hold. Some villagers began stacking extra wood at their doors. Others kept lamps burning through the night. It was as though the whole settlement was holding its breath, waiting for a blow that had not yet fallen. Inside the cabin, a different kind of storm was brewing. The woman grew stronger each day, her silence now replaced by quiet but deliberate words. She asked about the village, about the people, about why they lived where they did. The cowboy answered as best he could, though he could tell her questions carried more weight than simple curiosity. At times, she seemed almost to be measuring him, trying to decide what kind of man he was, whether he was someone who could be trusted or someone she should fear. Late one night, as the fire burned low, she finally spoke more of her past. Not much, only fragments. She said there had been fighting near the borderlands, that families had been scattered, that she had been running when the world turned against her. She did not say who had wounded her, but the way her voice caught told him she had lost more than blood in that grove. He wanted to ask more, but the look in her eyes stopped him. Some stories he knew were not ready to be spoken. The cowboy began to feel the pull of two worlds pressing on him. On one side, the village where he had lived, where duty and loyalty tied him to neighbors who now looked at him with suspicion. On the other, the woman who had come into his life by chance, who carried secrets that could draw danger to them all. He found himself caught between protecting her and protecting the fragile trust of those around him. Each day that passed without resolution only tightened the knot. The villagers' unease finally broke into action when a group of men came to his cabin one afternoon. They were not angry yet, but their tone was firm. They said the time had come to decide what to do with her. The settlement could not risk being seen as harboring an Apache while smoke rose on the ridge and riders were spotted in the distance. The cowboy listened, his hand steady on the porch rail, but his answer did not change. He told them she would stay until she was strong enough to choose her own path. The men exchanged dark looks before walking off, muttering that his stubbornness would bring nothing but grief. That night, the woman sat near the fire, her hands folded in her lap, and asked him why he would stand against his own people for her. He said he did not see her as enemy or stranger, only as someone left to die. She stared at him for a long time, her eyes unreadable, then turned back to the flames. In the silence that followed, the crackle of burning wood sounded louder than any words. But even as he spoke with certainty, doubt gnawed at him. What if the villagers were right? What if danger followed her here? What if, in saving one life, he had put the whole settlement at risk? These questions weighed on him with each passing day, yet still he could not bring himself to cast her out. The tension reached deeper still when one morning, before the sun was high, the dogs in the village began to bark. Riders had been spotted again, closer this time. Dust rose from the ridge and shadows moved where no shadows should. Fear spread like fire through dry grass. The blacksmith stood outside with his hammer in hand. Mothers pulled their children indoors and men checked the loads in their rifles. The settlement was bracing for something they could not yet see. Inside the cabin, the woman stood by the window, her posture rigid, her face pale, but determined. She whispered something in her own tongue, words he could not understand but whose meaning was clear in the sharpness of her tone. The cowboy felt his stomach tighten as he reached for his rifle. Whatever storm had chased her into his arms that day in the grove was no longer far away. It was here, pressing at the edges of the village, ready to break. And as the sky darkened with dust on the horizon, the cowboy realized the question was no longer whether he had done right or wrong. The question was how long the fragile walls of his world could hold before everything came crashing down. The dust on the horizon did not settle. It grew heavier with each passing hour, hanging like a storm cloud that would not break. The villagers gathered in small clusters, eyes fixed on the ridge, their voices sharp with worry. Even the children, usually noisy at dusk, were quiet, watching the adults with wide eyes that sensed trouble in the air. The cowboy stood near his cabin, rifle resting against the porch rail, his mind caught between the unease of the village and the silence inside his home, where the wounded Apache woman lingered near the fire. Every night since the riders had been spotted closer, she had moved less like a patient recovering from wounds, and more like a sentinel waiting for a signal only she could hear. Sometimes she would stand at the window, her gaze fixed on the distant hills, her body tense as though expecting someone to appear. The cowboy had asked her once what she saw out there, but she only shook her head, her lips pressed tight, unwilling or unable to speak. The tension in the village grew worse when the young hunters who had ridden out to the ridge did not return by nightfall. Men lit extra lanterns, some patrolled the edges of the settlement, while others whispered in corners that perhaps the hunters had met with the Apache, perhaps worse. Fear turned sharp, and suspicion turned sharper still. Some spoke the cowboy's name now, saying his decision to bring her into the cabin had drawn this danger down upon them. He heard those whispers as he walked by, and though no one spoke them to his face, the weight of them pressed heavy. He wondered if they were right. What if her presence here had lit a fire that could not be put out? Each time doubt gnawed at him, he would look at her again, see the scars on her skin, the guarded strength in her eyes, and remember how he had found her broken in the grove. Right or wrong, he could not bring himself to abandon her. One evening, as the prairie wind carried the sound of distant coyotes, she finally broke her silence. She told him in halting English that the riders on the ridge were not strangers to her. They were men who had hunted her people, men who had left her bleeding and alone. Her voice shook, but her eyes burned with a quiet fire as she spoke. She said if they were drawing close to the settlement, it was not by accident. They were looking for her. The cowboy felt the weight of her words settle into his chest. If what she said was true, then the storm building outside was not about the settlement itself, but about her. Still, he knew the villagers would never believe it. To them she was Apache, and Apache meant danger. Whether she was a victim or not did not matter in their eyes. That night, he sat by the fire while she slept, his rifle across his knees. Every creak of the log walls, every gust of wind against the shutters set his nerves on edge. In his mind, he saw the settlement torn apart, the people he had known for years scattered, all because of the choice he had made. Yet even in that dread, he knew there was no turning back. The next morning, the missing hunters stumbled back into the village. Their clothes were torn and their faces pale. They said they had been chased, though by who they could not clearly see. They swore they had heard voices in the night, men moving through the brush, shadows that vanished before they could fire a shot. Their story sent the settlement into a deeper panic. Women hurried children indoors. Men began stacking barrels by windows and doors as makeshift defenses. The word attack whispered through the air like a curse no one wanted to speak too loud. The cowboy returned to his cabin to find the woman sitting stiffly on the edge of the bed. She looked at him and spoke only one word: soon. He did not press her for more. He didn't need to. The look in her eyes said enough. She knew what was coming, and so did he. The next few days were restless. The settlement held its breath as though waiting for the ground itself to shake. Scouts claimed they saw movement in the hills, fires burning at night where no fires should be. Each sighting tightened the knot of fear in the village. Some demanded the cowboy hand her over, saying it was the only way to spare themselves. Others argued she was too weak to be a threat, but even their voices shook with doubt. The cowboy stayed close to his cabin, watching the prairie with eyes that never fully rested. At times he thought of riding away, taking her with him, leading the danger away from the village. But each time he looked at her weakened frame, he knew she could not yet make such a journey. And each time he looked at the faces of his neighbors, he knew they would see flight as proof of guilt. One night the dogs began barking wildly, their cries carrying sharp into the still air. Lanterns flared to life across the settlement, rifles clutched tight in nervous hands. From the ridge came the sound of horses, distant but clear. Shadows moved against the moonlight, too many to count. The village shuddered as though the prairie itself had opened its jaws. Inside the cabin, the woman stood, her hand braced against the wall, her body trembling but her eyes fixed on the sound. She whispered something he could not understand, then looked at him with a steadiness that silenced every doubt. She was not simply afraid, she was ready, as if this was the moment she had been bracing for since the grove. The cowboy loaded his rifle, his hands steady though his heart thundered in his chest. He stepped to the door, listening as the hoofbeats grew louder, closer, circling the edges of the village. The sound of riders calling out in the night carried across the prairie, words twisted by distance but filled with menace. The villagers stood in the dirt streets, their lanterns casting trembling circles of light. Mothers clutched children, men raised rifles but did not fire. Everyone waited, staring into the darkness just beyond their reach. The air was so thick with fear it felt like a weight pressing down on every chest. The cowboy knew the moment had come. The choice he had made in the grove, the choice to carry her back, had led them all here. And now, with riders surrounding the village and fear at its breaking point, there was no more room for silence. The story she carried, the truth of who hunted her, and the danger that followed, all of it was about to crash into their lives like a storm. He turned back once, looking at her in the dim firelight. She stood tall despite her wounds, her eyes meeting his with a fierce clarity. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Outside, the sound of horses circled closer, the voices sharper, the night alive with the tension of something about to break. And then, just as the village seemed to reach the edge of its breath, a single rifle cracked in the dark. The shot echoed across the prairie, splitting the night open, and the storm finally broke. The storm that had gathered over the plains seemed to roll away as the cowboy walked back into the small log cabin with the Apache woman at his side. Her wounds had healed enough that she could walk without much strain, though her steps were still careful. The long weeks of worry, fear, and silence had carved something lasting between them, something that went beyond survival. He had set out that morning long ago with his rifle slung over his shoulder, thinking only of fresh meat for supper. But what he had brought back instead was a story that changed the course of his life and the life of everyone in the village nearby. In the days that followed the confrontation in the canyon, the two of them spoke more openly. The mistrust that had hung heavy between them gave way to cautious understanding. Around the firelight, he listened to her voice as she told fragments of her story. She had not belonged to the raiding parties that stirred fear in the settlements. She had been caught in the crossfire of others' choices, her life uprooted by conflicts she never sought. The cowboy realized then that her presence in his life was not some burden he had stumbled upon, but a chance for redemption, for both of them. He had carried her out of the wilderness once, but in truth she had carried him out of his own loneliness. The townsfolk still talked, some in hushed tones, and others with sharp edges in their words. There were those who believed he was making a mistake by sheltering her, while others kept their opinions to themselves. Yet as time stretched on, people began to see not an enemy, but a woman who helped mend clothes, gather herbs, and share quiet kindness with the children who peeked curiously at her braids and beads. The village, for all its hard edges, softened little by little. In her silence, in her strength, they began to see humanity that reached beyond the barriers of culture and fear. The cowboy himself had been changed in ways he hadn't expected. He was a man known for riding out alone, for hunting and working the land without asking much from anyone. But with her beside him, he found himself opening up, even to the folks he used to keep at a distance. He took to teaching her English words while she taught him Apache phrases. They laughed over misunderstandings, and sometimes, when the evening stretched long, they shared stories of their pasts. He told her about the war he had fought in, the brothers he had buried, the ranch he once dreamed of building. She told him of the land she loved, of rivers that no longer ran the way they once had, of family she prayed was still alive. These exchanges built a bridge where once there had been only suspicion. Still, the shadow of danger lingered. The riders they had seen in the distance before had not disappeared from memory. There was always the chance that another raid would sweep through, that old violence would rear its head again. But the cowboy no longer felt that facing such trials alone was his only path. Together they began to prepare, not just for survival but for a future. He repaired the fences around his land with more determination, and she gathered seeds from the wild to plant near the cabin. They spoke less about fear and more about possibility. Each passing day tied them closer to the idea that they might build something worth keeping. The biggest change, though, was inside the cowboy himself. He realized that all his life he had been chasing something he couldn't name. He thought it was meat for the table, land for his boots, or a quiet life without interference. But what he had really been searching for was connection. The day he carried her out of the woods, wounded and silent, he had unknowingly found it. She was not a prize he had hunted, nor a burden he was forced to bear. She was proof that even in the harshest times, people could still find each other across deep divides. In the seasons that followed, the land itself seemed to acknowledge their effort. The crops took root, the cabin grew sturdier, and the prairie storms became moments of shelter instead of fear. Sometimes travelers passing through would stop at the cabin and find themselves welcomed with bread, stew, and the warmth of a fire. Some left whispering of how unlikely the pair seemed, but others carried the story of two people who chose to live beyond bitterness, beyond old grudges. The legend of the cowboy who went out hunting and returned, not with deer or rabbit, but with a wounded Apache woman, spread farther than either of them expected. Yet the story was not meant to be just a legend. It was the day-to-day living that mattered. The mornings when he woke to find her already tending the fire, the evenings when they watched the sun sink behind the hills, the small gestures that spoke louder than any words. They found in each other a partner who could weather hardship and still smile at the end of the day. And in the quiet spaces, they understood that what had begun with suspicion and fear had grown into trust and something stronger. The old American village nearby, with its clapboard houses and dusty streets, gradually came to accept them too. Children who once stared with wide eyes now ran to her side, to hear tales of the wild rivers and great animals she had seen in her youth. Men who had doubted the cowboy's judgment found themselves nodding to him in respect when they saw how steadily he worked, no longer the solitary figure he once had been. Women who first looked at her with caution began to ask her advice about herbs and remedies. Slowly, without ever forcing it, they had become part of the fabric of the place. The cowboy sometimes thought back to that first day, the smell of pine and blood in the air, the weight of her in his arms, the uncertainty of what would come next. He knew then that his life had been split in two, the man he was before and the man he became after. He didn't regret the change. If anything, he was grateful. For all the loneliness, for all the silence of the open plains, he had been given one unexpected chance to learn that home was not a place he built with his hands, but a bond he built with another soul. As the years passed, the story of that unlikely meeting became less about the danger and more about the choice to see beyond fear, to offer help when it would have been easier to turn away, to believe that peace was possible even in a land marked by conflict. It was not an easy road, but it was theirs. And in that old American village of the late 1800s, tucked against the endless horizon, the memory of the cowboy and the Apache woman remained, not as a tale of enemies, but as a reminder that compassion can change the shape of any story. And so the man who had gone out hunting and returned not with meat, but with a wounded woman found something he never expected. He found that sometimes life's greatest hunts are not for food or fortune, but for the simple, powerful truth of belonging. In that truth, he discovered not just survival, but a reason to live, and a reason to keep walking forward side by side with the woman he once carried out of the wilderness.